Welcome to Books in 5, where we interview the authors of recently published books on relevant topics. We'll be asking the author 5 questions, and they will have 5 minutes to answer each one. I'm very excited about my guest today, as he has written a fantastic new book about the evolution of firearms ownership in America. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. Please tell us your full name, the title of your book, and where you are joining us from.
Sure. Well, thanks, Pavan, for having me. My full name is Andrew C. Mckevitt, though I go by Drew. I am joining you today from my home in Shreveport, Louisiana. It's in the northwest corner of Louisiana. And I am the John D. Winters Endowed Professor of History at Louisiana Tech University, which is in Ruston, Louisiana. The book I wrote, which was published in 2023, is Gun Country, Gun Capitalism, Culture, and Control in Cold War America.
Andrew, let's begin with our first question. Let's lay the groundwork for your book, which looks at the post-World War II period as a catalyst for the development of gun culture in America. Why were you motivated to explore this topic?
Yeah, it's a good question because, originally I was not trained as a historian of guns in the United States. In fact, a lot of people aren't trained as historians of guns in the United States. They come at it from many different angles, and I was one of those people. I was actually trained to write about the Cold War and U.S. international relations and U.S. international history. My first book, in fact, was had nothing to do with guns. It was about the United States and Japan and its relationship in the 1970s and the 1980s. And what I was really interested in is the kind of local impact of big global things, right? So like, how is Japan's globalizing in the 1970s and the 1980s affecting Americans in many different local places throughout the country? So when I moved here to Louisiana in 2012, I knew almost nothing about the global impact of Japan on my new home state. And so it began with something as simple as like a Google search for Louisiana and Japan. And one of the things I came up with was a story I had not heard before, which was the 1992 shooting death of Yoshi Hattori. Yoshi Hattori was a 16-year-old Japanese exchange student who knocked on the wrong door around Halloween, and a white woman answered, saw an Asian teenager dressed up in a costume, screamed, slammed the door in his face, and yelled for her husband to get the gun. Her husband, a man named Rodney Piers, he ran to the closet and grabbed a .44 Magnum handgun, one of the most powerful handguns you can buy, and he confronted Yoshi in the driveway where he shot and killed Yoshi. So to me, this was obviously a horrific event, as it was for many Americans, but it was also kind of intriguing in the sense that this became a kind of international incident. So here I am thinking about U.S.-Japan relations, and here we have something very American, a shooting death of an unarmed child that becomes a kind of global incident in the sense that many people in Japan are horrified by this. How is it that you can how is it that you can answer your door when the child is there and confront him with a gun and then kill and shoot him, and then 8 months later, which eventually happens, get off scot-free, acquitted of manslaughter charges? And so to me, this is a really fascinating moment where to explore the global impact of American gun violence, how the rest of the world thinks about American gun violence. I never thought that this would drive me all the way back to 1945, writing about the story in 1992. But eventually that's what happened. I got some time off to really dive into the book. And I found myself going all the way back to 1945 to explain to the end of the Second World War, to try to explain how American gun violence was both a product of international relations and how it shaped U.S. international relations. And so I ended up diving into this book that really confronts a lot of myths about United States, U.S. gun culture and U.S. gun politics. The sort of big argument I start with at the outset of the book is that the big question I have at the outset of the book is, how do we go from a country of roughly 45 million guns in civilian hands in 1945 to a country 75, 80 years later of 450 million guns, right? So we see a tenfold increase in the number of guns in civilian hands in the United States over the course of about 3/4 of a century. How does that happen? It's not the traditional myths we have about the United States as a gun country that make that happen, right? It's not the frontier that makes that happen. It's not the Second Amendment that makes that happen. Something else makes that happen in the post-war era. And my argument is it's capitalism. It's the dramatic expansion of a gun consumer market in the United States.
Drew, let's move on to our second question. You detail the history of firearms in America as growing during the first few decades of the Cold War because of the relationship the country had with Europe. What was happening in the continent, and how were young Americans trying to take advantage of the military surplus?
Yeah, so the thing I really notice about these first post-war decades and the growth of a consumer gun market in the United States is the incredible growth of war surplus firearms available for Americans to purchase. So these are guns that were used in the recent war in Europe. So we're talking about tens of millions of firearms sitting in warehouses in France and West Germany and Italy and Great Britain that are being unused. The continent just went through the most horrific war in European, if not in world history. And so they're not eager to distribute these firearms to their population. They're not selling these firearms to their populations. In many of these countries, they had recently passed or are going to pass new laws that make it difficult or almost impossible for civilians to buy, in particular, military style firearms. So what are these countries going to do with all of these guns sitting in their warehouses? The answer to that question comes from a cohort of young, ambitious, entrepreneurial Americans. The one I really focus on in the book, his name is Samuel Cummings. Samuel Cummings will be, by the end of the 1950s, the world's largest private arms dealer, the world's largest private arms seller. He will also be, at the same time, the largest arms dealer, the largest arms seller to Americans, to the US civilian population. He does that. He builds that business. That business is called Interarms, which is he first begins in 1954. Interarms will become the world's largest private arms dealer and the world's most wealthy arms dealer by selling cheap guns to Americans. Sam Cummings, he gets his start really in the CIA right out of college. He goes to the George Washington University and he's hired right away as a CIA arms analyst. And what he's doing in 1950 when he's first hired is he's looking at reconnaissance photos from Korea, from the Korean War. And the CIA wants him to help identify the weapons that Korean troops are using, eventually that Chinese troops are using. And he's really good at that because since he was a young kid, he's been basically a gun nerd. He spent a little bit of time in the Army, basically training people, doing weapons training as well. He knows guns inside and out. After a little bit of time in the CIA, what they do is they send him to Europe. And over in Europe, he poses as a Hollywood producer buying prop guns for Hollywood films. And he's going all over the continent and he's buying up these war surplus weapons. And the CIA, through its kind of back channels, is shipping these guns to various American Cold War allies, most prominently to Taiwan, to nationalist China, which has fled mainland China after the revolution in 1949. So for Sam Cummings, this is an eye-opening experience. There's a whole continent here full of cheap guns that European governments are willing to get rid of, that they're willing to sell to me for tens of thousands, just posing as a Hollywood producer. There's a business opportunity here. And, as a young American kid, he knew that American appetite for firearms. And so after his stint in the CIA, he sets up Interarms, and he's going to basically do the same thing. He goes over to Europe, he walks into defense ministries, he throws down a suitcase full of cash, and he says, give me all of the old guns that you don't want. And in many cases, he's buying these guns for less than $1 each. So pennies on the dollar of what they would have originally cost. And so he's shipping them back to the United States. He builds a really extensive network of really extensive logistics network to get them back to the United States, to clean them up, to get them ready for the American consumer market. And he sells them through, he distributes them through the mail. He sells them by himself through the mail. He also distributes them to thousands of retailers throughout the country. And over the course of the next decade and a half, he's going to end up selling about anywhere from 5 to 8 million of these guns to Americans. And my argument is that those cheap guns, because he's selling them sometimes for $10 each, which is a tiny fraction of what a brand new hunting rifle might cost you, those cheap guns are going to spur a new consumer market in the United States. That's going to lead us from that 45 million in 1945 to 450 million today, doubling every 25 years the number of guns in civilian hands in America.
Let's move on to our third question. And you're bringing it up, but I really want to dive deep into it because it's one thing to have a large supply. There must also be demand. Can you talk about the impact of the marketing campaigns in the United States to convince people to buy guns?
That's right. So, there's for historians, there's this question of the demand for guns, right? Because another myth we have in the United States is that Americans have always wanted guns, right? Americans have always had guns, which is kind of sort of true, but certainly nothing on the scale of the second half of the 20th century. And Americans have always wanted guns, right? That desire has always been there. But for historians, we're a little sort of skeptical of that idea that one particular group of people are intensely desirous of firearms and will buy them at any opportunity, right? So demand often has to be generated. Demand has to be created. And there's a number of really creative entrepreneurs in the middle of the 19th century, going all the way back to the middle of the 19th century, when this thing that I call gun capitalism really begins, who are really innovative when it comes to generating that demand. It's figures that we've all heard the names of, people like Samuel Colt and Oliver Winchester and John Browning, all of these big giants of the US gun industry in the 19th century. Sam Cummings is, I argue, the giant of the American gun industry in the 20th century, and he's going to use marketing in a different kind of way to help generate that demand. Cummings' marketing isn't so much about, in contrast to the Remingtons and the Winchesters, who are often advertising their guns by connecting them to the American past, by connecting them to tradition, family, sporting, all these advertisements from the early 20th century would often show like a father and son, the father showing the son how to use a shotgun while they're out hunting for ducks or something like that. Sam Cummings, on the other hand, is completely shameless when it comes to advertising guns as quantity, not quality. So he really kind of pioneers this approach to gun advertising where he will pack dozens of guns on a single page. The idea being that the more you can show the consumer that you are swimming in cheap guns, the more likely you are to get their dollar. And so his advertisements are just shameless when it comes to really the kind of bounty of guns available to Americans. And his pitch is that you, as Americans, as victors in this great war, you are entitled to the world's bounty of guns. And I am here to sell it to you. I am using the knowledge I have acquired as a gun seller to go around the world and collect up all these guns and make them available to you. So the advertising helps generate that demand in the 1950s and into the 1960s. We're also talking about a moment when the United States is changing very rapidly. The United States is always changing very rapidly, but the important point in the post-war United States is that the United States is becoming very wealthy very quickly. Perhaps in 1945, the most wealthy country, the most productive country economically in all of world history compared to its peers, given that, its competitors have been shattered by by the war. Half of all productivity in the world in 1945 is in the United States. And so that the afterglow of that tremendous economic achievement, which was also a tremendous military victory, the afterglow of that is going to put a lot of money in Americans' hands. So they're going to have a lot of time for recreation. They're going to have money to go out and start new hobbies. They're moving out to the suburbs where they're closer to the fields and the shooting ranges where they might be able to test out a new gun. And so that too is going to generate demand for these guns. And, Sam Cummings' pitch is, don't go out and spend $150, the equivalent today of maybe $2,000 on a brand new hunting rifle from a company like Winchester. Give me $10 and I'll give you a really cheap gun that you can try out. And if you like that, you can go back next time and buy the Cadillac of hunting rifles or something like that. And so this kind of, he's ready to meet that demand with the marketing, with the supply. The United States is at a moment where there's so much more expendable income that it's kind of set up for Sam Cummings to get really wealthy selling all of these guns.
Drew, let's move on to our fourth question. Legislation and policy plays a large role in the story that you are telling. Walk us through the events of this period in both Washington, D.C. and in state capitals.
Yeah, so it's really it's not until the late 1950s that Washington notices the quote unquote problem of guns in the United States, of this flood of new firearms into the United States, of the rapid growth of firearms ownership. Ironically, the people who are going to lobby first for gun controls in the post-war United States are going to be the gun industry themselves. So they go to their Congress people in 1956, 57, 58, people like John F. Kennedy, senator from Massachusetts, and they say, Sam Cummings and his imports, they're killing us. They're taking away so much of our business. What's going to happen if the Soviets invade and you need our firearms to protect the country? What's going to happen if Sam Cummings puts us out of business? We need you to do something to protect us. So they're talking to the State Department about this, because the State Department is the government agency that gives permits to import firearms. And the State Department is never really thinking about the kind of guns it's bringing in, as long as they're not guns that are prohibited by federal laws from the 1930s, which essentially just prohibit machine guns, most importantly. As long as it's not violating that, the State Department is handing out import licenses to just about anyone, and nobody more than Sam Cummings. And so they go to the State Department and they say, you're allowing all of these guns in, and you're taking away so much of our business. And the State Department says, it's not our problem. We don't make economic policy for the United States. Go to your senators. So they go to Kennedy, they go to Congress people from Connecticut, because this is the so-called Gun Valley of the New England. And Kennedy and other Congress people from the region propose a law that would ban the importation of war surplus firearms. And fascinatingly, this is where you see the intersection of post-war economic development and the firearms industry and the Cold War. The State Department goes before Congress and says, we don't think you should ban the surplus of these imports. In fact, we think it's good that all of the guns are coming into this country. Because if they weren't coming into this country, they'd be going around the world to places we don't want them going. They might be going to Soviet insurgencies in Central America or North Africa or Southeast Asia, Soviet-inspired or Soviet-backed insurgencies, and of course to Washington in the 1950s. Anywhere they see communism, they see Soviet influence. And so their fear is that the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of firearms sitting in European warehouses are going to make their way to Cold War hotspots and cause even more foreign policy problems down the road. So their argument is, let the guns come here. We're better off having 5 million war surplus rifles come into the United States than we are having them go to Algeria or wherever else they're worried about communist-inspired insurgencies in the late 1950s. So the Cold War imperative is what helps drive the rapid expansion of this market. It's not going to be until the aftermath of Kennedy's assassination with, ironically, a weapon that would have been banned by his proposed bill that never made its way through Congress, where we get a real sustained, long-term, years-long effort in Washington to finally do something about the war surplus firearms. And that's going to come from Thomas Dodd, Senator Thomas Dodd from Connecticut, another gun state senator, who's going to beginning in 1963 and all the way up to 1968, push through the Gun Control Act of 1968, which will be the most important, even as sort of tame as it was, it'll be the most important federal firearms legislation in a generation, since all the way back to the 1930s. And among the things it does is it bans those war surplus firearms. They're also going to go after really cheap handguns, which are becoming increasingly a problem, especially in urban America, especially in the context of urban uprisings against police brutality, against inequality, against structural racism. These cheap handguns are seen as a crime problem, and the law is going to ban that as well, though ultimately the law proves kind of futile because capitalism is going to find a way. It's going to find a way around the barriers that the Gun Control Act tries to erect.
Let's conclude with our final question. You write about the efforts by activists to curb the spread of guns, and this has continued even after the Soviet Union fell. What is your assessment on their strategies and the outcomes that have come from their attempts to stop the violence?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, the grassroots gun control movement begins in the early 1970s. It's sort of ironic because you would think that the Gun Control Act of 1968, big federal legislation, would have been the product of grassroots political organizing leading up to 1968. But that's not the case. There was no real grassroots effort there. Much of the energy for that came from politicians, came from legislators, came from state legislatures. It's in the aftermath of the Gun Control Act of 1968, which proves to be a failure, which seems to do nothing about the growth of gun violence in the United States and the growth of gun ownership, that we start to see local grassroots organizing to do something about gun violence. So I write about two groups, both of them in Chicago, a city very much haunted by gun violence then as it is today. These two groups they're taking different approaches to the problem. One of them is called the Committee for Handgun Control, Committee for Handgun Control. And they're a group of self-identified suburban housewives. They live in the North Shore of Chicago. And their approach to this problem is to see it as a problem of consumer regulation. We regulate children's toys and lawnmowers and refrigerators more than we regulate guns. Why are we not using the apparatus of the federal government for regulation to control the most dangerous of consumer products, which are guns? And there's just kind of fascinating story about how they're going to get eventually a federal judge to force the Consumer Product Safety Commission to take up their effort to ban handgun bullets. It becomes a big kind of national controversy in the among those gun communities. They're going to raise hell over this, but eventually the Congress is going to step in and say, you can't do this. The CPSC doesn't have the authority to do it. But what it does is it points to a different way of thinking about the gun problem. It's a consumer problem, right? There's another group in Chicago. They're called the Civic Disarmament Committee, and they're led by a tremendous woman named Laura Fermi. Laura Fermi is the widow of Enrico Fermi. Enrico Fermi is one of the figures at the heart of the Manhattan Project. He dies in the early 1950s, and she becomes an activist in a whole bunch of different causes, including for gun violence in her neighborhood and around Chicago. And her approach to this is to think about it as a kind of human rights problem and a human security problem. if we can control, or at least take steps to control, the most dangerous weapons human beings have ever created, nuclear weapons, why can't we do something about these small weapons, these small arms that plague us on our city streets? And so in both of these cases, with both the Civic Disarmament Committee and the Committee for Handgun Control, their approach is really what we might call sort of abolitionist. They want to get rid of guns in civilian hands. And they're often pointing to, especially the Civic Disarmament Committee, they're pointing to the rest of the world and they're saying the rest of the world they don't let people carry guns around in the street. They don't let them keep them in their homes. This is not what a civilized society does. And, these two groups, they're going to organize throughout the 1970s. They're going to make connections to other lobbying groups. They're going to push into DC. But what they're going to find is that there's not much energy for that kind of abolitionist approach, at least when that energy requires money. What they're finding is that you get money when you confront the National Rifle Association. You can get money to fight the gun lobby, but getting money to do something as almost sort of naive and idealistic as to get rid of all of the guns, it's never going to happen politically. And in truth, we might have passed that moment in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when there was a chance to do something about widespread and virtually unlimited handgun ownership or any kind of gun ownership among the civilian population. And Congress balked. It passed the Gun Control Act. The Gun Control Act was proved to be ineffective, and Congress wouldn't do anything again for another 25 years, all the way up until the Brady Bill and the assault weapons ban of the early 1990s. And by then, 200 million guns in civilian hands. It was, in short, kind of too late.
Andrew, that has been our 5 questions. You've answered them in 5 minutes. Let's move on to our bonus questions. Drew, I'm interested in your motivation for becoming a professional historian. Tell us more about your background.
Yeah, so the thing that drew me into this, and there's a clue to this at the very beginning of Gun Country. It's that I dedicate the book. It says, this is dedicated to my grandfather, Carl Fazzi, who would have hated every word of it. And that's because he was both a history buff, as we might call it, somebody who loved to talk about the Civil War, really any era of history when I was a very young child. And he was probably also would describe himself as a gun nut. And so that's how I got both into history, and that's how I became interested in guns. Was this experience as a child with my grandfather, who would, he had Civil War battles set up in his office with little figures and that sort of thing. So that's how I first became interested in history many years ago.
Obviously, the book is a major achievement, but tell us more about another accomplishment that you're proud of.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm proud of having spent so many years teaching many thousands of students. Over the last 13 years here at Louisiana Tech, I have taught, I tallied this up a little while back, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 students have passed through my classroom in the last, since I started in 2012. And, often historians, scholars, we think about like the kind of public outreach we're doing. We're doing interviews like this, right? We're talking to media, we're writing books that get published and that get sold in bookstores and stuff like that. But really, I think the most important work we do to reach the public, and maybe the work I'm most proud of, is the work we do in the classroom, is the work we do with our many students.
Andrew, what are you working on next? Can you give us a hint?
Yeah, I all I can give you is a hint, because that's all I've got. I have so many different ideas, but so little work in any direction. One thing I'd love to do, kind of pie in the sky project, would be a biography of Sam Cummings, right? So I read about him in a couple of chapters here, but there just isn't a lot of material there yet to write a kind of extensive life biography of Sam Cummings, and I'd love to do that. The other thing I'm working on is a book project narrowing in on 1965 to 68, looking at the urban uprisings in places like Watts and Newark and Detroit, Washington, D.C., everywhere else in the aftermath of King's killing in 1968, and looking especially at how in the suburbs, white suburbanites were arming themselves for essentially a kind of, in many people's eyes, a kind of race war. And I write a little bit about this in the book, but that's another thing too, where I think I'd like to take a real kind of deep dive into many of the stories I found about that era.
Title of the book again is Gun Country. I definitely recommend buying it. If you're not able to purchase it, definitely check it out from your local library. It is an excellent book about a topic that we should all know more about. Andrew, where can people find you?
You can find me on Blue Sky. You can find me, just Google me, Andrew Mckevitt. You'll see my website. You'll see the books. You'll see everything else.
Andrew, thank you so much for joining us on Books in 5.
Pavan, thanks so much for having me. This was really terrific. I really appreciate it.
The host of Books in 5 is Pavan Sodhan. Books in 5 is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.